Hi everyone, welcome back to the garden. It's mid-November now, I'm still dealing with these pesky autumn leaves. In my last video, you saw me prepare my Gunnerum Anacarta or Cryptica for winter, putting the giant to sleep. Now, I'm talking about another tropical style plant that brings so much to my summer garden. I'm talking about cannas, how to look after them in winter, when to do it, do we even need to look after them in winter, and the best tips to get them growing really well next year. So let's get started. Mainly because it's quite windy and this is really heavy. So let's get going. To me then, cannas are an essential plant for any tropical style gardener display. With a magnificent height and presence in the garden, some of them get massive. They really do add a certain drama to your summer display. Others have got beautifully patterned leaves and they all tend to have the most amazingly bright, punchy coloured flowers. They really do add a touch of flamboyance, exuberance and richness to your summer garden. But when it comes to winter, you'd assume that plants that are so beautiful, add so much to your summer garden, are really tricky to look after in winter, proper divas that really struggle to get through. But the reality is very different, and a lot of cannas are actually surprisingly easy to look after. This is what I do with mine in winter. Here in my garden, I have cannas dotted all through the borders to really add a vibrant, lush leafiness to my summer display. And then at the entrance to the garden, flanking either side the jungle path, I've got two pots of these huge canna musifolia, which really are an incredible canna. All this top growth comes in one season. They can even get twice as tall as this. But as winter comes, those first hard frosts come, all this growth will get blackened. We're not worried about the stems, the leaves, or even the flowers. All these get chopped down around mid to late November. I tend to do it before the frost gets them, just so they're easier to handle and not a complete mushy mess. And these get recycled straight onto the garden soil, essentially creating a living mulch that will rot down over winter and help protect other plants. As we're now in mid-November then, these are the cannas that I had in the ground and I chopped them back yesterday. They will be getting cut a little bit closer to the soil, but as you can see, I've been ruthless with a machete and hacked them all back to within a foot of the ground. The huge canna musifolia that I grow in pots flanking either side of the entrance to the garden, they've had similar treatment. They've been chopped back as well. And at the base there, you can see, as I push through these leaves, the new rhizome shoots pushing through there. And this is a part of the plant that's essential to protect in winter. I generally chop my cannas back then around mid to late November. They're certainly not the highest on the list of priorities when it comes to overwintering, looking after tropical plants in winter. The tender houseplants come in way before this point. The Ensete just about brought in now. And while I'm digging up and lifting the Ensete anyway, I decide to chop the cannas down. It feels like the right time and they're not going to grow much more beyond this point anyway. Traditionally, cannas were classified as semi-hardy exotics, half-hardy, along with dahlias that were dug up around October, November time, which always seems such a shame because they look their absolute best when you hack these back. But at this time of the year, like I said, they're not going to grow much anyway, and the first frost will start to blacken the leaves and the stems. So I always think, chop them back before they get mushy, and then look after them, and once it's done, it's done. Traditionally, they would have been brought into a polytunnel or greenhouse and just kept into a pot over winter. Essentially, dig the rhizome up carefully, starting a bit wider than you need to so you don't damage it, brush off most of the soil, and then put it in a pot that's just about big enough, put new compost in there, move it into a greenhouse or polytunnel that's ideally kept frost-free. Don't let them entirely dry out, but you don't want them wet through winter, and they just keep ticking over. You can pack straw, horticultural fleece or leaves just on top of them to shield that part of the rhizome from the worst of the winter cold if you're not going to heat your polytunnel. But that's the way that I've generally done it. The cannas in pots just get wheeled straight into the polytunnel, and if I'm going to lift some, I do the same. Dig them up, put them in the pot, fresh compost around it, pack them into the polytunnel, and maybe water them every couple of months just to stop them completely drying out, increasing that as we go into spring. Traditionally then, cannas would all have been lifted, but thanks to a lot of intrepid, adventurous, exotic gardeners, potentially yourself, we found recently that a combination of experimentation and milder winters on average have actually allowed a lot of cannas to stay in the ground over winter and come back in spring. So really, it can be a game of trial and error. Some cannas will come back from the ground, others won't. And to give you an example of that, here in my garden, I had lots of different cannas down this side here. The only ones that have come back in this particular area here from last winter, when we had 2 freezing weeks, is Canna Altensteinii, a variety that I grew from seed, a good big tall canna, and I found them to be really hardy, very resilient plants. My Canna Stuttgart, on the other hand, they haven't come back. But 10 minutes down the road, my friend Mark's house, check it out in the Mark's Crazy Tiki Garden video series. His canna Stuttgart look incredible. They've done really well this year. But over there, canna Cleopatra haven't come through. So like a lot of plants, it really does depend on the exact variety that you grow, the conditions in your garden. Is it shady? Has it got quite damp soil like here? Or is it well drained? And how cold the winter's going to be. Some cannas might come back from a winter having a low of -3, -4. Others might come back from -6, -7, and -10 might kill them completely. So like a lot of these exotic plants, it really depends on whether you want to play it safe, experiment, gamble. Really, it completely is up to you. But how I generally do things here, my big potted cannas, they're already in pots, and potted plants are more vulnerable to freezing through anyway. So those just get moved, lifted straight into the polytunnel, kept there over winter. And when it comes to plants in the garden, traditionally, I have pretty much left everything in the ground and just seen what's happened. But if you're new to growing cannas, if you're not sure whether they're going to make it through in your garden in this particular winter, it might be worth digging up, lifting a few of them, put them in pots and bring them into a polytunnel greenhouse, potentially even a shed or garage for the colder months of the year. Option 1 then, leaving the cannas in the ground. If you live somewhere relatively sheltered, you've got quite free draining soil, or you're not expecting this winter to be a cold one, if you're one of those kind of people, then just leave them in the ground, chop them back at this time of the year, and preferably give that rhizome a good mulch, because some rhizomes can be close to the surface, and sometimes it's not necessarily a case of a plant dying or living. If a plant gets hit hard by the cold, it can take longer to come back, it can be stunted and shriveled and never look its absolute best the following year. So I really would recommend a good mulch over the top of the cannas once you've chopped them back. And what is a mulch? Simply a blanket of material over the top of the ground to protect the plants underneath. I would recommend something like straw. You could use the chopped back leaves and stems of the canna directly over the top of it. You can use old potting compost, you can use composted farmyard manure. The options are really endless, but applying a thick layer of that over the top essentially shields the plants from the deeper cold from the freezes really reaching into the soil. It is absolutely worth doing. The benefits of leaving them in the ground are, well, firstly, it's a lot easier, and an easy garden is definitely the way forward. And secondly, once those plants have been in the ground, you've got that root structure in there, the plants are settled in, and although they can take a bit longer to appear in spring, once they do appear, in my experience, they grow away rapidly, they're established plants, they motor up through the summer, and you end up with bigger plants by the end of the year. Option 2 then is bringing your cannas into a polytunnel greenhouse for winter. This is always what I recommend for potted plants to shield them from the elements in winter. But when it comes to plants in the ground, I would recommend going down this route if you live in a colder part of the country, if you've got particularly waterlogged clay soil where plants generally don't come through very well, or you've got a particularly special canna that you want to do everything you can to keep it for next year. That's generally what I would recommend doing. I don't heat my greenhouse or polytunnel to ridiculous temperatures. Cannas only really need to be frost-free to give them a really good chance of making it through. So I literally have a Bi-Green Phoenix heater. I'll put a link to it in the description below. I keep the temperature to the lowest setting, which is 2.6 degrees, and I only switch it on when the temperatures drop below freezing. So it really is minimal care, minimal cost, and it seems to get plants like cannas and gingers through winter very reliably. So obviously it goes without saying, digging them up, lifting them, bringing them to the greenhouse or polytunnel does take more effort than just simply leaving them in the ground. But in the scheme of things, it doesn't take that much time. And because you're chopping the plants back, they are very space efficient in the greenhouse or polytunnel. If you've got any kind of benches or staging, they can even push under them. And that way, very little space used, but you've got a great chance of getting them through winter. A big advantage of growing them in the polytunnel greenhouse is that you get a head start in spring. Those plants, helped by the extra heat, will often start pushing through by early April time. You'll see the new shoots appearing when the ones that are in the ground are definitely still sleeping, waiting for the temperature to warm up. So you get a head start, you get bigger, stronger plants when you actually put them out into your garden. They're definitely a lot safer from slugs and snails, because ultimately you don't know how next spring will end up. You don't know if it's going to be a cold start. You don't know if those plants are going to get hit by a late frost in late May, early June even. Whereas your plants that are in the polytunnel greenhouse, you can keep those safe with a combination of heaters and fleece. The ones that are out in your garden, definitely a little bit tricky to protect. And the slugs and snails, if we end up with a really wet spring, they can be absolute treats for the slugs. Your cannas can get nibbled off, and that way it really sets them back and your summer display takes longer to appear. Ultimately, I do think the ones in the ground get bigger, they're more established by the end of the season, but giving them that head start really can be crucial in less than optimal situations. Option 3 then is bring your cannas inside. With some tropical or exotic plants, such as Begonia luxurians, some of the colocasias, I generally think you have to pretty much grow them as houseplants. They won't tolerate being dry stored, they won't really enjoy it in a just frost-free polytunnel or greenhouse, but when it comes to cannas, in all honesty, I don't think they're worth the space inside. With plants that are so easy and efficient to overwinter, whether that's in the ground or very easily packed away into a polytunnel or greenhouse, it makes little sense to have those plants taking up valuable space in your house. Really save that place for the plants that absolutely have to be there, unless you're wanting a divorce to come your way very quickly. I personally would look after cannas in the most efficient ways possible. I know they're fantastic plants in summer, and I know the temptation to keep them growing strongly is definitely there, but for me, it's just not worth giving up one of those prime spaces for a plant that's going to be leggy and lanky inside anyway, with the extra heat and minimal light in there. You can collect the seeds from your cannas in the garden, but unfortunately, after a cool summer like this one, these Altensteinii seed pods are mostly green. Some brown ones, so there might be some viable seeds there, but I certainly wouldn't recommend doing this instead of one of the other methods, something you can also try as well. Got more geese heading off there. They know what's coming. People off on the holidays, again, they know winter's coming. But when it comes to this time of year, a lot of the truly tropical plants, they don't know that winter's coming. So with plants like cannas, it can seem a shame to chop them down in the prime. But if that's what gets them through, it really is worth doing. Whether you choose then to leave your cannas in the ground, protect them with a thick mulch, or dig them all up, lift them, and bring them into a polytunnel greenhouse over winter, there is no right or wrong way. It completely depends on your experience with your garden. Every location's different, every garden soil's different, every winter's different, so really do what you feel is right for you. But either way, it's worth a tiny bit of effort that it takes to give these plants a great chance of making it through to next year. Because plants right now are incredibly expensive. To have a big, mature, established clump of cannas, that's going to make a real statement in your garden next summer. So it's worth putting a little bit of effort in. But I'd be intrigued to know in the comment section below. Firstly, feel free to leave any questions as usual, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. But secondly, let me know if you tried growing cannas for a few years now. Are there any varieties that struggle to make it through winter that you wouldn't recommend others growing? Or alternatively, are there any varieties that have really done well for you, come back from surprisingly cold spells? That'll be interesting to know too. But I'll end the video with a few practical tips. Firstly, if you are digging your cannas up, it can be tempting to see that massive rhizome, how much it's grown over summer, and start splitting it up. I personally would recommend waiting until spring before you do that. Practically speaking, it's so much easier to overwinter that plant in one pot. And also, if you're splitting up a plant at this time of year, you're creating new cut surfaces in the plant that can potentially rot through the long, cold, grey months of winter. It really is worth leaving them till spring, then split it up. Plants generally grow better with the extra light, the extra heat, particularly in a polytunnel or greenhouse, so that is the time that I would personally do it. It's also well worth labelling your cannas at this time of the year. If you've got them in the ground, you'll probably remember where they are, but just push a cane in so you remember, because especially during a cold spring, cannas can be one of the last plants to make an appearance. And the worst thing for most gardeners is when you see a space of bare soil in spring, you're going to throw a load of bedding plants to that area. So it's well worth just remembering where they are and being a little bit patient. And when it comes to those pots you take into the greenhouse or polytunnel, although I do recommend leaving about 6 inches or so of stem showing above the soil, over winter they will wither away. So it's well worth labelling, remembering which varieties are in which pots. That way you can remember your different heights of cannas, the colours, and you can plan your summer display out next year even easier. So I hope this video has helped you. Apologies if I've been more talking than usual, but looking after cannas really is so much easier than you might expect at first. As always, any questions, leave them in the comment section below. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.